Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So, I want you to imagine a world where your peace of mind literally costs blood, like actual blood.
Yeah, that's a lot to visualize.
Right. Where to clear your conscience of, this week's mistakes or just the things you've done wrong, you had to physically bring a living animal to a tent in the middle of the desert.
And not just drop it off.
Exactly. You hand it over to a priest and you have to watch it die. You watch its blood be drained and carried into this dark, terrifying room that you personally were never, ever allowed to enter.
It's a completely shocking image for a modern mind. I mean, it's just so visceral.
Visceral, messy, and deeply sensory. But that was the reality for the ancient audience.
And honestly, it's the perfect starting point for what we're talking about today. Because humanity has always, across every era, every culture, felt this innate barrier between itself and the divine.
We sense a gap.
We sense a massive gap. And for centuries, the attempt to bridge that gap involved these incredibly rigid rules, exclusive physical spaces, and, well, really complex systems of appeasement.
But today, we're looking at a text that just completely dismantles that old system. It introduces this radical internal revolution of the human heart.
It really does. It flips everything on its head.
So today's deep dive is an extensive exploration of the biblical book of Hebrews, specifically chapters 8 through 10. We are going to be using the World English Bible text alongside two of the most renowned historical commentaries out there.
Right. Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Yeah, the analytical 19th century insights of Barnes, and then the really rich, practical 18th century reflections from Henry. And for you listening right now, whether you are a seasoned scholar or just, insanely curious about how ancient texts shape human psychology, our mission is to extract the practical wisdom from these incredibly dense chapters.
And they are dense. To really grasp the magnitude of the shift the author is describing, we have to immerse ourselves in their world.
The first century context.
Exactly. The author is writing to a group of Jewish people who were intimately familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. And they were facing immense, crushing social and cultural pressure.
To basically abandon this new path.
Right, what we now call Christianity. The pressure was to return to the familiar, structured, deeply historical system of the Old Covenant. Because it was a system they could see, touch, and smell.
It was tangible. And before we can appreciate how radical the new covenant is, we need to understand that old world.
We really do.
Because I'm trying to picture this ancient setup that Albert Barnes describes. And, it sounds less like an inviting place of worship and more like an impenetrable fortress.
Oh, totally. It was designed to keep people out.
Right. So what did this old system actually look like on a practical level?
Well, we have to look at the ancient tabernacle, which is described in detail in chapter 9. The text tells us that this first covenant had ordinances of divine service and an earthly sanctuary.
An earthly sanctuary, so a physical space.
Right. Picture a magnificent, highly structured, very heavy tent. It wasn't just pitched casually for a weekend camping trip. It was the epicenter of the community. And this tabernacle was divided into two distinct, highly segregated rooms.
Okay, so an inner and an outer chamber. That sounds like a physical representation of hierarchy.
It was a profound physical metaphor. So the first part was called the holy place.
What was inside that one?
Inside, you had the golden lampstand, which is often called the menorah, and that provided the only light in the structure because there were no windows.
No windows at all. Wow.
None.
Oh.
You also had the table and the showbread, which was 12 loaves representing the tribes of Israel. And this room was active. The text says the ordinary priests went continually into this first part to accomplish their daily services.
So they're maintaining the light, burning incense, doing the routine.
Exactly. But they couldn't just keep walking. There was a barrier.
A massive one, right?
A huge one. There was a second veil. And, we shouldn't picture a flimsy, sheer curtain blowing in the breeze.
Like a living room drape.
Right, no. Historical sources suggest this veil was incredibly thick, heavy, ornate fabric. It completely blocked any light or sightline from the first room.
And behind that second veil is the Holy of Holies.
The inner sanctum, the place where the divine presence was said to actually dwell.
Okay, so what is in that room? Because it sounds terrifying.
Inside this Holy of Holies was a golden censer for incense and the Ark of the Covenant, which was this wooden chest overlaid on all sides with pure gold.
Right, the famous ark.
Yeah, and inside that ark was a golden pot holding manna, the food that sustained the Israelites in the desert, along with Aaron's rod that budded and the actual stone tablets of the Ten Commandments.
Wow. So all the heaviest historical artifacts.
All of it. And above the ark, forming the lid, were the cherubim of glory, angelic figures made of gold, overshadowing what was called the mercy seat.
I am just trying to imagine the psychological weight of this space. It's visually stunning, heavy with gold and thick fabric, completely dark except for whatever light the priest brought in, and silent.
Completely silent.
And the rules of access were terrifyingly strict. The text points out ordinary priests were restricted to the first room, but the second room, only the high priest could enter there.
Only one man out of the entire nation.
One guy. And not just any time he felt like it. He could only enter once a year.
Once a year, on the Day of Atonement.
And crucially, he could never enter without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people.
He had to have the blood.
If we map this onto a modern scenario, I just keep picturing the most exclusive, secure corporate hierarchy on the planet.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Like, imagine a towering corporate skyscraper where the CEO, representing God in this analogy, runs the entire world from a penthouse boardroom.
Right.
The average employee or the average citizen doesn't even have the security clearance to enter the lobby, let alone the elevator. They are kept completely on the outside.
They're not even in the building.
Exactly. They have to send one specific executive once a year up to the penthouse. And that executive has to carry very specific credentials, in the ancient case, the blood of a sacrifice, just to crack the door open for a few minutes.
And if he messes up the protocol,
he's fired, or worse. The entire system is built on exclusion. That physical architecture communicates something devastating about the human condition.
Matthew Henry's commentary actually explores that exact devastation. He points out that this physical separation, this strict limitation of access, was a deliberate, profound lesson.
What was the lesson?
It signified that the way into the holiest of all was not yet fully open. Henry describes this era as a dispensation of darkness, dread, and bondage.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because dispensation is one of those heavy theological words that can easily trip us up. What does he mean by a dispensation of darkness?
Fair question. A dispensation is essentially a system of order. Think of it like a specific administrative era or a regulatory regime.
Oh, like a presidential administration.
Sort of, yeah. Henry is saying that during the specific historical period, the regulatory regime was characterized by dread. The physical architecture itself, the heavy veils, the restricted access, the constant need for animal sacrifices, all of it was a constant visual reminder to the people that they were fundamentally alienated from their creator.
So the building itself was the message. It was a massive golden "do not enter" sign.
Albert Barnes adds another layer to this. He points out that the author of Hebrews calls these physical setups a figure or a shadow for the time then present.
A shadow.
Yeah. The Greek word the author uses is parabole, which is where we get the word parable. It means a symbol or a representation.
So these weren't just arbitrary or cruel rules.
No, they were pedagogical tools. They were physical metaphors meant to teach a developing human society two really vital things: the extreme gravity of moral failure, sin, and the ultimate unapproachable perfection of the divine.
So the sheer difficulty of the system was kind of the point. By showing the ancient people how incredibly hard it was to clear their conscience and approach God, it was supposed to make them realize the system was unsustainable.
It was exhausting by design.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The Band-Aid proves you know there's a problem, but it also proves you need a surgeon.
And the author of Hebrews explicitly states this limitation. The text says that these gifts and sacrifices could not make the worshiper perfect in conscience.
Ah, the conscience.
Right. They only dealt with foods and drinks and various washings regulations for the body imposed until a time of Reformation. Barnes notes that the whole service of the tabernacle was typical, meaning it was a type or foreshadowing.
It was a standing demonstration that the problem of human guilt hadn't been fundamentally solved. It was merely being managed externally.
Exactly. Being managed, not cured.
Which means the entire Old Covenant was always meant to be a placeholder. It was an alarm clock, not the destination.
That's a great way to put it.
And if the external rituals could only purify the flesh, but could never actually reach down and scrub the conscience clean, the author has to offer a massive paradigm shift. A solution that doesn't just manage behavior, but changes the human operating system entirely.
This shift is where Chapter 8 anchors its argument. And it does so by pulling from the ancient prophets.
Right, because this wasn't coming out of nowhere for the Jewish audience.
You know, long before the author of Hebrews wrote this letter, The Jewish prophet Jeremiah predicted that the old system would be replaced.
I actually have that passage here. It quotes Jeremiah and it reads, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind. I will also write them on their heart. I will be their God and they will be my people."
That is a complete 180-degree turn from stone tablets and thick veils.
It's the ultimate internal revolution. Under the old system, the laws were written on tables of stone, kept locked inside a golden box, behind a thick curtain, inside a tent.
They were entirely external to the human being. Albert Barnes writes extensively about the profound difference this creates in human motivation. He points out that the Old Covenant required compliance to external laws, largely out of fear, threat of punishment, or, societal obligation.
It was behavior modification.
Right. Do this or else you will be cast out.
But the new covenant secures obedience by changing the very disposition of the human heart.
Barnes emphasizes that the grand uniqueness of this new arrangement is that it regulates the conscience. It regulates the principles of the soul. When a law is written on your heart, you aren't obeying it because a priest is watching you or because you're terrified of a lightning bolt.
You obey it because your fundamental desires have been altered to align with it.
You actually want to do it.
Applying Barnes' logic here asks a very uncomfortable question of the modern listener. We look back at the ancient Israelites with their animal sacrifices and heavy curtains and think they were primitive. But how often do we operate with the exact same old covenant psychology today?
Oh, constantly. We just use different rituals.
We might not be carrying goats to a tabernacle, but we are obsessed with optics. We live in an era of intense public scrutiny and cancel culture.
The modern arena of public opinion functions very much like an external law.
Absolutely. We spend enormous amounts of energy curating our digital lives, checking the boxes of societal compliance, making sure we say the right things and support the right causes so that we look pristine on the outside.
We manage our public behavior out of a profound fear of being ostracized.
But behind the veil of our public persona, in our own internal holy of holies, our character might be completely untouched. We can be perfectly compliant on the outside and entirely toxic on the inside. That is the definition of the Old Covenant experience.
And the burden of maintaining that external facade is exhausting. Your conscience remains burdened because deep down that the outside doesn't match the inside.
It's the imposter syndrome of the soul.
That's why Matthew Henry's commentary provides such a comforting perspective on this text. He highlights that under this new dispensation, this new regulatory regime, God doesn't just change the heart's desires. He fundamentally alters the historical record of the person's failures.
What does the text say exactly?
It quotes God saying, "I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. I will remember their sins and their iniquities no more."
Remember them no more. That is a staggering concept.
Henry notes that God treats those sins as if they had never happened. When we consider the psychological implications of absolute amnesia regarding our worst failures, it is revolutionary. Think about how human beings hold grudges, or how we constantly review our own past mistakes at 3 a.m.
Oh, the 3 a.m. regret loop. We hold our own past over our own heads. We operate under the assumption that if people really knew what we had done or what we had thought, we would be ruined.
But true forgiveness, the kind described here, removes that paralyzing dread.
Because if the ultimate authority in the universe says, "I have no memory of your infraction," it destroys the fear-based compliance model. Fear only works as long as the enforcer is angry and watching. Once the enforcer forgives, the motivation has to change.
And that leads directly to the practical application for someone listening right now. The text challenges us to evaluate our driving forces.
Right. So if we take this ancient text and lay it over our lives this week, the practice for you is to run an audit on your motivations. Look at the good things you do, your charity, your patience at work, the way you treat your family, your community involvement. Are you doing those things from a sense of external obligation?
Are you just checking a box to keep up appearances and avoid criticism?
Exactly. Or are your actions flowing naturally from an internal transformation? Are you operating from the exhaust fumes of fear and optics, or from the sustainable energy of a transformed, forgiven heart?
It's a vital diagnostic.
Yeah.
Because if you are only operating from external pressure, you are essentially still living in the shadows of the old covenant. You're burdened by a heavy conscience. The new covenant is an invitation to step out of the shadow and into a reality where the internal conscience is actually clean.
Okay, but as we transition into chapter 9, The modern reader who is tracking with us, who loves the idea of an internal revolution and a clean conscience, is about to hit a massive, uncomfortable wall.
The blood wall.
Yes, because just as we get comfortable with the idea of internal peace, the text abruptly pivots to a very messy, very visceral reality, a relentless focus on blood.
Chapter 9 does not soften the blow for delicate sensibilities.
It really doesn't. Hebrews 9.22 says, according to the law, nearly everything is cleansed with blood, and apart from shedding of blood, there is no remission. I have to be honest, this is where a lot of people just check out.
Yeah, it's rough.
We live in the 21st century. To a modern ear, the idea that the divine requires the killing of animals, the blood of bulls and goats, to grant forgiveness feels primitive. It feels barbaric, like something out of a Dark Age cult. If the ultimate goal is a peaceful internal revolution of the heart, why is the author dragging us back into an ancient slaughterhouse?
It is entirely valid for a modern reader to recoil at this imagery. Yeah. We buy our meat wrapped in plastic at the supermarket. We are completely disconnected from the visceral reality of biological life and death.
We don't see the process.
At all. But this is where we need to exercise serious wisdom with discernment. We have to temporarily set aside our modern sensibilities and understand the ancient worldview. To the ancient mind, blood was not just a biological fluid you see when you scrape your knee.
What was it to them?
Blood was the literal, physical manifestation of life itself. The ancient scriptures declared the life of the flesh is in the blood. It was the ultimate, irreplaceable currency of existence.
So to spill blood was to spend life. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher.
Precisely. And Albert Barnes provides a brilliant linguistic and legal argument to help us bridge the gap between our modern legal concepts and this ancient practice.
A legal argument?
Yeah, he focuses on the specific Greek word the author uses for covenant, which is diathek.
Okay, how does that differ from our normal understanding of a covenant? Usually when we hear covenant, we think of a contract or a treaty between two parties, like a marriage covenant or a peace treaty.
And the Greek language had a word for that exact concept. Syntheke, which means a compact or agreement between equals.
Like a partnership.
Right. But Barnes points out that the New Testament writers deliberately avoided using syntheke. Instead, they consistently used diatheke. This word refers to an arrangement or a disposition made by a superior party. And crucially, in standard Greek usage, diatheke carries the specific legal meaning of a testament.
A testament, like a last will and testament.
Yes. Whoa. And what is the fundamental legal requirement for a last will and testament to actually take effect and distribute the inheritance?
The person who wrote it has to die. You don't inherit the estate while your grandfather is still alive and healthy. The death is the mechanism that activates the document.
Exactly. Chapter 9, verses 16 and 17 make this exact, airtight legal argument. The author writes, "For where a last will and testament is, there must of necessity be the death of him who made it. For a will is in force where there has been death, for it is never in force while he who made it lives."
So the author is taking the theological concept of forgiveness and explaining it through the lens of ancient estate law.
Yes. Under the old arrangement, human moral failure, sin, was understood as a capital offense against the architecture of the universe. It brings death. The law demanded life. So animal blood was used as a placeholder.
The animals were substituting for the people.
Exactly. When the ancient worshiper brought an animal, they were actively acknowledging, my actions have brought death into the world. This innocent life is legally substituting for mine to ratify this arrangement.
But the author immediately points out the fatal flaw in that system. In chapter 10, the text explicitly states, "For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins."
Which is the crux of the entire argument. Those animal sacrifices were just a yearly reminder of sins. They were shadows. They could provide a temporary, external, ceremonial cleanness so a person could participate in the community. But the blood of an animal could never reach down and scrub the human conscience clean.
Because an animal doesn't have moral agency. An animal doesn't volunteer.
Right. It doesn't choose to be a substitute.
To use a financial analogy, the old system of animal sacrifice was like paying the minimum balance on a massive high-interest credit card debt.
Oh, that's deeply relatable.
Right. You make the payment every month, or, in the ancient case, the high priest makes the payment every year on the Day of Atonement. And that minimum payment keeps the bank from foreclosing on your house. It keeps the wrath of the law off your back temporarily. But the debt is still there?
The principle hasn't been touched.
It just keeps rolling over year after year, gathering interest in the form of deep internal psychological guilt. You never actually own your life. You are just perpetually servicing the debt.
That analogy perfectly captures the exhaustion of the Old Covenant. The debt remains. The conscience still knows the balance is outstanding. The worshiper walks away from the tabernacle knowing they will have to be back next year with another animal.
So what breaks the cycle? What is the revolutionary shift that finally pays off the principle?
The shift is a voluntary human sacrifice of ultimate worth. The author quotes Psalm 40, applying the ancient poetry to the arrival of Christ. The text says, "Sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, but you prepared a body for me. Behold, I have come to do your will, O God."
I have come to do your will. It wasn't about the sheer volume of animal blood at all. It was about obedience. It was about a human will perfectly aligning with the divine will.
Matthew Henry points out a vital distinction here. He notes that the beasts offered under the ancient law could not consent. They could not choose to put themselves in the sinner's place. They were dragged to the altar. But Christ's sacrifice was the oblation of himself.
There's another heavy word, oblation.
An oblation is a formal offering or presentation of a gift. Henry is emphasizing that Christ's death was a voluntary substitution. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was the orchestrator of the testament. And if we connect this to broader human wisdom traditions, we see a fascinating comparative insight that elevates the text of Hebrews above ancient mythologies.
Right, because animal and even human sacrifice wasn't unique to the Jewish people. We see it everywhere in the ancient world.
Across ancient global cultures, from the Aztecs in Mesoamerica to the Celts in Europe to the various pantheons of the ancient Near East, humans offered desperate sacrifices to appease angry, hungry, unpredictable gods.
The underlying theology of the ancient world was transactional fear. The gods are angry, the crops are dying. We must give them blood to bribe them into leaving us alone.
But the author of Hebrews flips this entirely on its head. The God of the Bible, as presented here, is not a hungry, bloodthirsty deity demanding a bribe from humanity to calm down. Rather, God provides his own ultimate voluntary sacrifice to cleanse the human conscience.
The text says God prepared a body for this exact purpose.
The massive debt of human failure isn't paid by us desperately scrounging up enough animals or good deeds. The debt is paid by the creditor himself stepping into our reality and absorbing the cost.
To borrow the credit card analogy, the creditor pays off the principal of the debt out of his own infinite account. It closes the account of guilt forever.
This is what theologians call expiation, the actual objective removal of the guilt, wiping the slate completely clean. The text declares this triumphantly in chapter 10. For by one offering he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified.
Let's define sanctified for the listener, just to be crystal clear.
Sanctification is the ongoing process of being made holy, or being transformed internally to reflect the character of God. Barnes notes that when the text says, "we are perfected forever," it doesn't mean human beings never make mistakes or act selfishly again. We all know that isn't true.
We still stumble.
Always. It means that in regard to our legal standing, our justification before the divine court, the expiation is complete. The case is permanently closed. The conscience can finally rest because the ultimate debt is actually objectively gone.
The relief of that is staggering. But, and this is a big but, and as we move into section 4, we encounter a massive rhetorical whiplash.
Oh yeah, it hits hard.
Because if this once-for-all solution is so absolute, so total, and freely given, then rejecting it must carry universe-altering consequences. The author doesn't let us just sit comfortably with the idea of a clean slate. We are thrust directly into what might be the starkest, most terrifying warnings in the entire biblical text.
The tone shifts dramatically from soaring theological triumph to dead serious warning.
I'm going to read this passage from chapter 10, and I warn you, it is heavy. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remains no more a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and a fierceness of fire which will devour the adversaries.
It's a test.
And the author doubles down a few verses later, saying, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Now I have to push back here. This feels like a massive contradiction.
How so?
We just spent the last half hour talking about complete forgiveness, God forgetting our sins, tearing down the veil, and the end of fear-based religion. Now the author is talking about the fierceness of fire and the terror of God's hands. Doesn't this sound exactly like the toxic, abusive fear-mongering we were supposedly leaving behind in the Old Covenant? How does perfected forever coexist with devoured by fire?
It is the most vital question you could ask. And it's a passage that has caused immense, often unnecessary anxiety for readers throughout history. People read this and become terrified that a single mistake has doomed them.
Right. I sinned willfully today, so I'm going to the fire.
But this is where looking at the original Greek language and utilizing the careful distinctions made by Barnes and Henry is absolutely crucial to clarify a deeply misunderstood text.
Walk us through it. What does it actually mean to sin willfully?
We have to start with what it does not mean. This passage is not talking about failing in your daily moral struggles. It's not about having moments of profound doubt or stumbling back into a bad habit or losing your temper. It is not addressing the normal, grueling process of human sanctification, where we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
So it's not saying if I know lying is wrong, but I panic and tell a lie at work, I've lost my salvation and I'm facing the fire.
Not at all. The key hinges on the specific Greek word translated as willfully, ekousios. This word implies a deliberate, calculated, malicious, and final rejection of the truth.
A final rejection.
Yes. Albert Barnes explains that this warning applies to a case where a person deliberately and permanently abandons their faith and turns away from the entire system of grace with open contempt. The author describes this as someone who has trodden underfoot the Son of God and has counted the blood of the covenant an unholy thing, and has insulted the Spirit of grace.
Insulted the Spirit of grace. So this isn't a slip-up. This is a total, hostile walk-away.
Matthew Henry points out that this refers to total and final apostasy. Apostasy is the formal disaffiliation from or abandonment of a religion by a person. It's when someone who has known the truth fully, who has understood the magnitude of the sacrifice, decides to treat it like garbage. And when we understand the historical context, the logic of the warning becomes incredibly clear, not arbitrary.
How does the historical context change the reading?
Remember the audience. They are facing severe persecution. Their property is being seized. They're being publicly mocked. The temptation isn't just to quietly fade away. The temptation, often forced upon them by local authorities, was to publicly renounce Christ, declare the new covenant a fraud, and return to the temple sacrifices to save their own lives and social standing.
So the author is warning them about the ultimate consequence of that public betrayal.
Exactly. And the logic is straightforward. Let's use an analogy. Imagine you are in a plane that is going down. The engines have failed. Someone hands you the only parachute on board. It's a flawless, perfectly packed parachute that cost an immense amount to create. But instead of putting it on, you take out a knife, look the person who gave it to you in the eye, cut the parachute to shreds, and throw it out the door.
If I do that, I can't suddenly ask for a backup parachute. I just destroyed the only mechanism that exists to save my life.
Precisely. The author of Hebrews isn't making an arbitrary, petty threat like a tyrant whose ego is bruised. He is stating a terrifying logical necessity.
It's just cause and effect.
Right. If Christ's sacrifice is the ultimate, final, and only mechanism in the universe that can truly cleanse the conscience and reconcile humanity to the divine, if it is the final will and testament, then actively rejecting him leaves you with nothing else to save you. There remains no more a sacrifice for sins, because there isn't another savior waiting in the wings. There is no plan B.
That reframes the entire passage. It's not God pacing back and forth looking for an excuse to strike you with lightning because you broke a rule. It's the reality of rejecting the only cure to a fatal disease.
Exactly.
If you are dying of an infection and you take the only vial of antibiotics in the world and smash it on the floor in defiance, the doctor doesn't have to murder you. The disease simply takes its natural, devastating course. You have chosen the fire.
And the enduring value here, as Henry helps us see, is that truth is deadly serious. The ultimate reality of the universe, the grace that was purchased at such an incomprehensible cost, is not a toy. It is not to be trifled with or treated as a common or unholy thing. The universe operates on moral gravity. Grace is free, but it demands reverence.
That is a sobering reality check. But having understood the mechanics of the sacrifice, how the ultimate debt is paid, and the universe-altering stakes of rejecting the truth, the author doesn't leave his readers in a state of terror.
Thank goodness.
Right. As we move into section 5, we see a masterful transition into soaring, incredibly practical encouragement for daily living. This is where the theology hits the pavement. How do we actually walk in this new and living way without being crushed by the weight of it all?
This is where the psychological freedom of the new covenant really shines. And it stands in brilliant contrast to where we started this discussion. Let's look at the text again. The author writes, "Having therefore, brothers, boldness to enter into the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the way which he dedicated for us, a new and living way, through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. Let's draw near with a true heart and fullness of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and having our body washed with pure water."
I am captivated by that word, boldness. Think about the contrast to what we talked about an hour ago regarding the tabernacle. Before, the high priest crept into the Holy of Holies once a year, terrified, hoping he had enough animal blood to not get struck dead by the holiness of the space. Now, the text says we have boldness to enter.
The Greek word there is parrhesia, which means freedom in speaking, unreservedness in speech, or free and fearless confidence. It's the right of a citizen to speak their mind in the assembly.
Returning to our corporate skyscraper analogy, it radically changes the scenario.
How so?
A normal mid-level employee would never dream of just kicking open the solid oak doors to the CEO's boardroom during a high-stakes global strategy meeting. They would be tackled by security and fired immediately. But if the CEO's 7-year-old child comes running down the hallway, they don't even look at the security guards. They burst right past the desk, throw open the boardroom doors, and run straight into the CEO's arms, interrupting the meeting. Why? Because the CEO is their father. The rules of access are dictated by the relationship. The veil is torn. We have that kind of parrhesia, that kind of boldness.
It perfectly captures the theology of the passage. The access is completely unrestricted because the relationship has fundamentally changed from alienated subject to reconciled child. We're invited to draw near with a true heart.
It's an invitation, not a threat.
Exactly. But the author doesn't just leave this as a private individualistic meditation. Religion and true spiritual growth are deeply, inescapably social.
Which brings up a critical challenge for our modern culture. We read a little further down. Let's consider how to provoke one another to love and good works, not forsaking our own assembling together, as the custom of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching.
Provoke one another to love. It is such an aggressive, proactive verb. Barnes notes here that the human soul needs mutual edification. We are not designed to sustain the spiritual life in a vacuum.
We really aren't.
If we translate this ancient exhortation into our modern context, it speaks directly to our current cultural crisis. We are living through an unprecedented epidemic of loneliness and digital isolation. We are technologically connected to thousands of people, but increasingly isolated from genuine, challenging human contact.
We curate our social media feeds to project an image, but we don't have people in our physical lives who truly know us. We don't have people who can look us in the eye and call out our hypocrisy, or more importantly, call us up to our highest potential. We treat community like an optional streaming service we can cancel when it gets inconvenient.
And the author of Hebrews recognized the deadly danger of that isolation even 2,000 years ago. He warns against forsaking our assembling together. Whether it was due to the intense fear of Roman persecution or simply the slow fade of apathy, people were drifting away from their physical community.
They were just fading out.
Yeah. The insight here is that you cannot sustain this new and living way on your own willpower. Your own conscience, scarred by years of old covenant thinking, will inevitably try to drag you back into the mindset of fear, performance, and hiding. You need the physical voices of a community to verbally remind you of the truth when you forget it.
So, applying this text to the listener directly, here is the practical question to wrestle with this week. Who in your life are you actively provoking in a positive, challenging way to love and good works? Who are you intentionally encouraging to step up and live out their beliefs with boldness? And equally important, who has the permission to do that for you?
Do you have a community that refuses to let you settle for mediocrity and isolation?
Right. Because according to this ancient text, isolation isn't just lonely, it is a fast track to losing your boldness and falling back into bondage.
And that robust community support becomes absolutely vital when we look at the final gritty piece of practical wisdom in this section, the necessity of endurance.
Yes, the author provides a massive reality check at the end of chapter 10. He asks the audience to look backward. He talks about how they had endured a great struggle with sufferings. He reminds them that they faced public reproaches, oppressions, and even joyfully accepted the plundering of their possessions.
It is so important to contextualize the severity of this. As Matthew Henry points out, in the early days of the gospel, believers were targeted by both religious and imperial authorities. They were made a gazing stock, which means they were publicly humiliated, perhaps in the theaters or the public squares, for their beliefs.
They literally had their homes and businesses confiscated by the state or by angry mobs. It was a brutal, terrifying environment.
Extremely brutal.
And while you listening today might not be facing an angry mob seizing your house because of your theological beliefs, we all face what the text calls a fight of afflictions. For a modern listener, that fight takes different but equally exhausting forms.
It could be anything.
It might be a grueling, years-long battle with mental health and depression. It might be the devastating, lingering grief of losing a loved one. It might be the quiet, cultural alienation of holding on to ancient moral truths in a society that aggressively mocks them. The specific afflictions change across centuries, but the human need for resilience doesn't change a bit.
Which is exactly why the culminating wisdom the author imparts here is so crucial. He says, "For you need endurance so that, having done the will of God, you may receive the promise." Endurance, patience.
A grind.
Yeah, hupomone in the Greek, which means cheerful or hopeful endurance, constancy. Henry notes that it is a profound trial of the patience of Christians to be content to live in a broken world after their internal transformation is done and to wait for the ultimate reward until the proper time.
It's the unglamorous reality of a spiritual life. You just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. You don't throw away your boldness when the circumstances get dark.
The author's strategy here is brilliant. He reminds them of their past victories to fuel their present endurance. Remember the former days, he says. You survived that initial fire. You can survive this current darkness. You accepted the loss of your earthly possessions back then because your perspective had shifted. You knew you had a better, enduring possession in the heavens. Your gaze was eternal, not temporal.
So if we pull all of these massive concepts together, if we synthesize this profound journey we've just taken through Hebrews chapters 8, 9, and 10, what is the ultimate takeaway? We have moved from a terrifying world of external, temporary shadows, a world defined by strict barriers, thick, impenetrable veils, and the exhausting yearly reminders of guilt through the blood of animals.
And we have transitioned through the logic of a divine testament into an internal, permanent cleansing of the conscience. A revolution achieved not by human striving or perfect behavior, but through the willing, once-for-all sacrifice of Christ who absorbed the debt.
Which results in something completely unprecedented in human history. Bold, fearless access to the creator of the universe. We can walk right past the veil and into the boardroom. And from that secure place of a forgiven identity, we aren't called to be isolated monks. We are called to build a resilient, gritty community that provokes each other to love and endures the inevitable grinding sufferings of life with patience.
It is a profound masterclass in moving from exhausting religious performance to transformational reality. And I want to leave the listener with the final echoing words of chapter 10. The author quotes the ancient prophet Habakkuk saying, "But the righteous one will live by faith."
Live by faith.
I want you to ponder that concept this week. What if faith isn't just an intellectual agreement with a set of theological facts or historical data? What if faith is the gritty, daily endurance of stepping into that new and living way, with a clear conscience, refusing to be paralyzed by the guilt of your past, and holding fiercely onto the promise of God, even when the physical world around you feels like it's completely falling apart?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.